Canada's economy is struggling. On the surface, with universal healthcare, security, and a high literacy rate, Canada might seem to be a paradise. But of course, the surface is never really that shiny. Canada suffered several blows: a housing crisis, an unemployment crisis, and poor government choices. Canada's economy is like a house of cards waiting to fall. If you're wondering how a country like Canada could ever get to this point, keep watching. We'll be evaluating all the causes behind Canada's present economic position. The beginning of trouble. To understand how Canada's economy finds itself in such a devastating place, we need to go back. Canada's history is a rich and nuanced one. The events of Canada's economic past can shine a light on the troubles the country faces today. Canada might even help us work out possible solutions in the present. Canada is a vast country. For being the second largest country in the world by land area, Canada has a relatively small population. With approximately 40 million Canadians, the country's population is only slightly higher than California's. Unsurprisingly, throughout Canada's history, its economy has been intertwined with its geography. Historically, Canada's economy has been inseparable from the Canadian landscape. Soon enough, industries began to form around these resources. This process of industrialization began with fur trading, logging, and fishing. During the 20th century, however, Canada became known for exporting oil and hydroelectricity. As the economy grew, Canada developed other industries too. These industries included finance, automotive, and pharmaceuticals. Despite these developments, Canada relies on natural resources. Natural resources have always been the primary driving source of Canada's economy. In recent years, however, something has gone wrong. A recent forecast by OECD predicts that Canada's economy will decline. The forecast predicts that out of a group of rich countries, Canada's economy will slump compared to other members. And it's just not the economy that's in shambles. Right-wing extremism is on the rise. There's aggravated climate change, wealth inequality, a housing crisis, and consumer debt. Now, more than ever, Canada's populace needs change. But where will this change come from? The 2023 Edelman Trust Barometer Canada report reveals that Canadians don't trust their institutions as they used to. Not only that, Canadians today are 60% more polarized than they were in the past. Unsurprisingly, then, the report also shows how economic anxieties are at an all-time high. We might say that the main issue is productivity. Generally speaking, productivity refers to how much income a worker generates. Canada's productivity has not grown much in the past few decades. While Canadians used to be as productive as Americans in the past, that has all changed. Now the average American worker is 40% more productive than the Canadian worker. To put it simply, this means that Canadians are making less money than Americans. To put this into perspective, consider this. Today, the average American worker earns $57,000, while the average Canadian makes less than $44,000. So, why is this happening? In simple terms, Canada has changed its priorities. It doesn't rely upon natural resources anymore. Instead, Canada is transforming into a real estate and housing economy. This is where the source of all trouble lies for the Canadian economy. To better understand this economic transformation, let's have a look at some of the key factors contributing to the Canadian economy's decline. Canada's housing crisis. The global financial crisis of 2008 was utterly devastating. While it took a heavy toll on the US and UK financial markets, Canada did not suffer the same fate. That being said, the effects of the 2008 financial crisis can be felt by the Canadian economy today. Back then, in an attempt to stimulate the economy and prevent it from crashing, the Bank of Canada dropped interest rates. As a direct result, mortgages became extremely cheap and the housing sector began to thrive. Suddenly, home-owning Canadians felt wealthy and safe, which, in turn, led to an increased number of home purchases. Unbeknownst to these homeowners, however, the falling interest rates had created a safety bubble. While homeowners felt a false sense of security during the global financial crisis, the decision to lower interest rates was not without its consequences. Another big change occurred in 2014, when global oil prices collapsed, affecting Canada's oil exports. As investment in oil decreased, businesses and the government turned their focus to the housing market. At this point, the housing sector appeared to be the most lucrative area of investment. In the years that followed, Canadians began to invest more in real estate than in business. As more and more immigrants flooded into the country, more houses were needed. As a result, more money was poured into the housing market. By 2020, with the outbreak of the COVID pandemic, all hell broke loose. The Bank of Canada suddenly dropped interest rates to zero during the pandemic. House prices spiked up to 50% as demand increased. Homeowners in Canada, despite owning their homes, however, started facing challenges. In an attempt to combat rising inflation, the Bank of Canada raised interest. In turn, raised interest increased mortgage costs. With time, these high interest rates are only expected to rise. As interest increase, so will mortgage costs. This does not bode well for the future of the Canadian economic landscape. Today, 40% of mortgage holders borrow money to cover their daily expenses, whereas over 20% are struggling with their mortgage payments. Although the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada has introduced new guidelines, there's not much change happening. The risk of homeowners defaulting on their mortgages is more pressing than ever. And that's if you can afford a house. For most Canadians, the dream of owning a house is likely to be just that, a dream. The average price of a Canadian house is currently around 700,000 Canadian dollars. A report from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives revealed that in every Canadian province, the minimum wage made by the workers was higher than the wage required to rent a one-bedroom unit. As a consequence of rising housing prices, thousands of Canadians suffer from homelessness. In a 2016 report, the number of homeless Canadians was estimated to be around 235,000. That number is only likely to have increased given the state of the housing market. Surmounting debt. Another reason behind Canada's struggling economy is the surmounting levels of debt that the country has accumulated. The primary cause behind Canada's stumbling economy is the housing market. As prices continue to soar, many Canadian households are struggling with heavy debt. Typically, this debt appears with mortgages, auto loans, and credit cards. A rather alarming statistic is the fact that Canada's household debt is higher than any other nation. In 2021, Canada's household debt hit a record 107%. With such high levels of debt, an economic crisis comes off as no surprise. The situation has gotten so bad that the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation issued a warning. Setting a record high, the total consumer debt in Canada has now reached $2.32 trillion. As Canadians find it increasingly difficult to keep up with payments, the future is not looking too bright. With inflation on the rise, it's getting near impossible for the average Canadian to make their payments on time. And, as we mentioned earlier, in order to combat rising levels of inflation and mortgage costs, the Bank of Canada raised interest. But this move was counterproductive. While attempting to control inflation, this move increased mortgage costs. And these mortgage costs were why the high interest rates were implemented in the first place. In simple terms, the economy is trapped in a vicious cycle. Mortgage rates drive inflation, which leads to increased interest rates, which increase mortgage costs. It's expected that the government will increase interest rates again. This time, the rising interest is there to reduce inflation to the 2% target. The long-term goal is to reduce inflation by controlling spending. But the immediate impact of these changes makes it impossible for some Canadians to survive. Not only is the government unrealistic in its 2% inflation goal, they're squeezing the economy as tight as they can. Meanwhile, with high mortgage costs, limited housing supply, expensive prices, and significant consumer debt, Canadians are desperate. As interest rates continue to rise, there's also the very real possibility of an impending unemployment crisis along the way. Government choices. Taking into consideration the tragic state that the Canadian economy is in, the question begs to be asked, what is the government doing to help? The Bank of Canada's main job is to make sure the country's money stays stable, not caring much about people's immediate financial struggles. Their primary focus is on controlling inflation, which is an important aspect of Canada's economy. In short, they don't want a repeat of what happened with the housing market. The government wants to ensure that prices don't rise too quickly in the long run. Reducing prices is an important goal. If the government wants to heal Canada's broken economy, they need long-term solutions. But governments are also supposed to care about their citizens. And right now, the people who are most affected by Canada's collapsing economy are its citizens. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a clear-cut plan on how to help Canadians actually affected by financial problems. In the midst of such economic turmoil, Justin Trudeau's government is looking to find $15 billion cuts to reach its inflation target. Given the fickle state of the economy, this decision seems to be a major misstep. Making cuts does not reduce the problems Canadians face today. What does Canada's future look like? So far, we've looked at some of the major causes behind Canada's splintering economy. At a surface level, these problems might seem too complex to have a solution. But if there's anything that Canada's history proves, it's that its economy is always susceptible to change. The transformation from a resource-based economy to a housing economy will take some time to play out. There's no telling if it'll be successful or not in the future. Perhaps Canada will bounce back from the economic slump that it's fallen into, or perhaps the housing crisis will grow even worse. One thing is abundantly clear. In the midst of all this economic turmoil, Canada's government has an important role to exercise in providing effective solutions in the long run. How do you think Canada's shifting economy will impact the global economy? Share your insights in the comments below. And as always, we'll be reporting on how this situation plays out. Thanks for watching, and make sure to keep an eye out for our next video.